the 11th of June 1694. The Ukrainian steppes near the village of Hodów. 400 Polish soldiers peer intently at the horizon. What appears before their eyes chills the blood in their veins. Tens of thousands of Tatar warriors, from 25,000 to 40,000, like a black cloud over the steppe. The balance of power is terrifying. 1 to 100. The mathematics are brutal. 400 against 40,000. There is no chance of survival. Any commander in the world would give the order to retreat. Any sane person would flee, saving their life. But these were not ordinary men. They were Polish Hussars and Pancerni, the elite of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And on this day, they would etch their names in history as co-authors of one of the most insane victories in the annals of war, Thermopylae. There were 300 Spartans against 1,000 Persians. Here, the ratio is even more absurd. 400 Poles against an horde, capable of wiping entire cities off the face of the earth. The Tatars are absolutely confident of victory. They see only a small gathering of enemies and laugh. It will all happen quickly, swiftly, cruelly, and mercilessly. But the Polish commanders, Konstanty Zagorowski and Mikołaj Tyskowski, had a plan so brilliant, so flawlessly executed, that the Tatars would pay for their overconfidence with rivers of blood. This day would not be a Polish defeat. This day would turn into a nightmare for the Tatars. What happened in this steppe? How did 400 men manage to survive a clash with an army 100 times their size? And why was it not a defense, but a complete annihilation of the enemy's cavalry? If you enjoy true stories that sound like unbelievable fiction, give us a like and subscribe to the channel, because what you are about to hear will change your perception of what is possible on the battlefield. The Battle of Hodów, 400 warriors, 40,000 enemies, 0 chances of survival according to all laws of war. But the laws are powerless when it comes to the Polish military machine of the 15th century. Zagorowski and Tyskowski did not just survive, they crushed the enemy. They annihilated them so mercilessly that the Tatar Khans would remember this day for years to come as a terrible warning. How did they manage it? What strategy did they use? How? The devil himself. Did 400 men stop waves of a 50,000-strong cavalry? The answer lies in brilliant tactics, iron discipline, and courage beyond human comprehension. This is not a legend. It is not an exaggeration. It is a documented history of one of the most incredible battles ever fought. And you will soon learn all its details. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the late 15th century was a power, but exhausted by bloody wars. For decades, it fought on all fronts. In the west against the Swedes, in the east against the Tsardom of Muscovy, in the south against the Ottoman Empire and its vassals, the Crimean Tatars. The borders of the Commonwealth were an endless battlefield. The Crimean Tatars were an unusual enemy. They were a vassal khanate of the Ottoman Empire, pursuing their own predatory policies. For centuries, they had terrorized the Ukrainian steppes. Their specialty was shafats, or raids. They ravaged villages, killed men, kidnapped women and children. The slave trade formed the basis of the khanate's economy. Every year, thousands of Christians ended up in the slave markets of Kaffa. The military system of the Commonwealth was a response to this threat. Hussars, heavy armored cavalry, the elite of the elite; Pancerni, medium cavalry, mobile and deadly effective; dragoons and infantry. But in the late 15th century, the Commonwealth was involved in the Great Turkish War since 1683. Jan II Sobieski had defeated the Turks at Vienna in 1683, but the war was not over. 1694. The Commonwealth was fighting Turkey, repelling Tatar raids, defending its borders. Forces were dispersed. The main armies were on other fronts. The Ukrainian steppes were guarded by small patrol detachments. This was constant rotation, continuous vigilance, because the Tatars could strike anywhere, at any moment. The Crimean Tatars were masters of steppe warfare, light cavalry, horse archers, lightning mobility. They did not engage in frontal battles with heavy infantry or armored cavalry. They would strike quickly, plunder, and disappear. Their armies could cover 200 kilometers in 3 days. They would surround the enemy, shower them with arrows, and wear them down. When the enemy weakened, they would deliver the decisive blow. The Crimean Khanate was a warlike state. Every man was a horseman and a warrior. They could quickly field armies numbering in the tens of thousands. The Ottoman Sultan used them as a tool of terror against his enemies. In 1694, they were planning another major shaffat on Polish lands. Why was Ukraine an eternal battlefield? Because it was the borderland of civilizations. To the north and west lay the Commonwealth, the Christian European world. To the south and east, the world of Islam and the steppes. Cossacks, Tatars, Poles, Turks, all fought for control of these lands. Whoever controlled the steppes, controlled trade routes, controlled access to the Black Sea. Konstanty Zagorowski and Mikołaj Tyszkowski were experienced commanders. They were not young noblemen seeking glory. They were veterans who had survived dozens of battles. They knew the Tatars. They knew their tactics. The vast steppe expanses of Ukraine were familiar to them. They realized that in an open field, 400 warriors were doomed against a superior enemy, but they also knew ways to change the balance of power. The Polish army consisted not just of masterfully trained soldiers. These were men who deeply understood the importance of discipline. Training hussars required years of labor. Pancerni were noblemen trained in military matters from an early age. Each of these 400 men was worth 10 ordinary soldiers. However, even this was not enough against a 100-fold enemy advantage. The Tatars were strong in numbers. They had mobility. They possessed extensive experience in steppe warfare. They knew that Polish detachments patrolled the borders. They knew of their scattered nature. The plan was simple. Strike with lightning speed, destroy each Polish detachment individually, without allowing them to unite. Then plunder, capture slaves, and return to Crimea with loot. No one expected 400 Poles to resolutely stand their ground. No one could have foreseen that these men had devised a plan that would turn the Tatars' certain victory into the worst nightmare of their military history. Mathematics predicted one thing. Reality turned out to be entirely different. The Polish detachment numbered exactly 400 men, 120 hussars, elite heavy cavalry in full armor with long lances, 280 Pancerni medium cavalry, more maneuverable but no less deadly. The rest were dragoons and auxiliary infantry. Command was divided between Konstanty Zagorowski and Mikołaj Tyszkowski. Both had equal authority. Both were experienced veterans. The mission was routine: border patrol along the Ukrainian steppes, observation of Tatar movements, protection of the local population, intelligence gathering. The Commonwealth Army constantly maintained such patrols, rotating them every few weeks, maintaining vigilance. No one expected this patrol to encounter the entire Tatar invasion army. The equipment of the hussars was a masterpiece of military art. Plate armor covering the torso, a helmet with a nasal guard or visor, mail on the shoulders and hips. The hussar lance was a pike 5 to 6 meters long, lightened by being hollowed out from within, but deadly effective in attack. A Polish saber at the side, pistols or carbines in the saddle. Some had additional wings. The hussar wings, though their practical application is debatable, had a huge psychological impact. The Pancerni wore lighter armor, vambraces on the forearms, a breastplate, sometimes a cuirass. Greater mobility, less protection. Their weapons were a saber, a shorter lance than the hussars, pistols. They were faster. They maneuvered more easily. In the open field, they conducted reconnaissance and covered the flanks. The first news of Tatar movements came from local Cossacks. A huge horde had crossed the border. Not hundreds, not thousands, but tens of thousands. Zagorowski and Tyszkowski understood what this meant. This was a major shaffat, not an unusual raid, but a full-scale invasion. A decision had to be made immediately. Retreat. 400 horsemen could have slipped away from the huge army. The Tatars were fast, but the Polish commanders knew the terrain. They could have retreated, joined the main forces of the Commonwealth, and avoided a battle. This would have been reasonable. It would have been safe. But retreat would have meant the Tatars having free rein. They would burn villages, kill the population, kidnap thousands of people into slavery before the main Polish army could react. The horde would disappear back to Crimea with their loot. Zagorowski and Tyszkowski looked at the map, looked at each other. The decision was made without words. They would fight. The choice of location was crucial. Hodów was a small settlement, but the terrain offered an advantage. Relatively flat, but with small elevations, open enough to see the approaching enemy from afar. and confined enough that the Tatar numerical superiority could not surround them all at once. Here they would make their stand. Here they would build their fortifications. Enemy reconnaissance confirmed the worst fears. It wasn't 20,000. It could even be 40,000. The horde was so large it covered the horizon. Tatar banners fluttered in the wind. The sound of thousands of horses' hooves echoed across the steppe. It was an army capable of capturing a city. Before them stood only 400 men. The soldiers saw the horde. Some paled, others remained silent. The hussars checked their armor, tightened their straps, checked their lances. The Pancerni cleaned their sabers. No one spoke of escape. No one voiced their fear. This was the elite. They knew what awaited them. They knew the chances were minimal. But they served the Commonwealth. They served honor. Zagarovsky gave the first orders. Build a tabur. Use every wagon, every cart, every available material. The Pancerni began their work, stood guard, observed the approaching horde. Time was inexorably slipping away. In a few hours, the Tatars would be here. They had to be ready. Tiskowski organized the defensive sectors. Which unit defends which section? Where best to position the archers? Where to keep the reserve? Where to shelter the horses so they would be safe but ready for action? Every detail mattered. One mistake, and everyone would perish. The soldiers worked in silence. No time for talk. The wagons were arranged in a circle, bound together with chains. The wheels were blocked. The gaps between the wagons were filled with sacks, barrels, anything at hand. A fortress was created, primitive, improvised, but effective. This was their only chance. Having finished their work, they surveyed their creation. The tabur stood. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. Now they waited. The Tatar horde was inexorably approaching. The sun began to set in the west. The battle, which perhaps none of them would survive, was about to begin. The tabur was a Polish military specialty, a tactic known for centuries, honed by generations of commanders. The principle was simple. Combat wagons arranged in a circle or square formed a mobile fortress. But the devil was in the details. Zagarovsky and Tiskowski knew every one of them. The wagons were placed wheels outward and shafts inward. Between each wagon, there was just enough space for a man not to squeeze through, but enough for the soldiers inside to shoot through the gaps. Chains connected the wagons, creating a continuous barrier. The wheels were blocked with wedges so the wagons could not be moved or overturned. Stakes sharpened at the ends were driven between the wagons. Simple, crude, effective. A Tatar horse would not charge stakes. The rider would have to dismount to remove them, and then he would become a target for Polish archers. Every breach in the defense was protected in this way. The height of the wagons provided an additional advantage. Polish soldiers shot from above, Tatars attacked from below. The difference could be 1 meter to 1.5 meters. But in combat, this was a huge advantage. It was easier to aim down than up. It was easier to defend from a higher position. Strict order prevailed within the tabur. The horses were gathered in the center, protected from arrows. This was the most valuable resource. Without horses, cavalry was useless. Around the horses were ammunition, barrels of powder, boxes of bullets, arrows, spare weapons, everything at hand, everything organized. The tabur was divided into sectors. Each sector had its commander, its unit responsible for defense. Hussars occupied the most important points, those where the attack would be most likely. Pancerni were evenly distributed to support each sector. Dragoons and infantry filled the gaps, operated firearms. Firearms were a key element of the defense. Muskets, arquebuses, carbines, anything that shot. Polish soldiers carried their personal weapons, but there were also additional supplies in the tabur. Each musket was a death at a distance of 100 to 150 meters, a volley of 200 firearms, a wall of death for the attackers. Ammunition was meticulously counted. Each soldier knew how many bullets he had. Each volley had to be effective. There was no room for waste. Zagarovsky ordered to fire only on command, to fire only at specific targets. Discipline in firing was the difference between survival and annihilation. Water and provisions were gathered in the center of the tabur. The battle could last for hours. It could last for days. Soldiers had to drink, they had to eat. Dehydration killed just as effectively as a Tatar saber. Barrels of water were guarded. Food rations were distributed fairly. The final preparations before the battle. checking every detail. Sector commanders reported readiness. Zagorowski and Tiskowski walked along the inner side of the tabur, checking positions, talking to the soldiers. There were no speeches, no pathos, only calm, professional preparation for battle. The night before the battle was quiet. Soldiers slept in shifts, half on duty, half resting. Sentries watched the darkness. In the distance, the lights of Tatar campfires were visible. The horde had made camp. Tomorrow, they would strike with full force. Some soldiers prayed, prayers, flying, quiet conversations with God. Others wrote their last letters to their families, though they knew they would likely never be delivered. There were also those who simply sat in silence, looking at the stars, each prepared in their own way. Dawn on the 11th of June, 1694, the first glow in the east. The Tatar horde began to move. The sound of drums echoed across the steppe. Shouts, war cries, whistles. This was the ritual before battle. The Tatars stirred up their fury, intimidated the enemy, and not a sound came from the tabur. Polish soldiers stood at their positions, weapons at the ready, ammunition loaded. Everyone knew what to do. Zagorowski and Tiskowski stood in the center of the tabur. They watched the approaching enemy through the gaps between the wagons. The horde was immense, even larger than it seemed yesterday from afar. 25,000, maybe 30, maybe 40. The exact number no longer mattered. It was a sea of people and horses. The banners of the Khanate fluttered in the wind. Tatar leaders sat proudly in front, confident in their victory. They saw the tabur. They saw the 400 Poles. They laughed. It would be easy. Such a small fortress. So few defenders. They would break the wagons, kill the soldiers, take the loot, perhaps not even lose many men. It would be a short skirmish. But the Tatar commanders did not know who they were dealing with. They did not know how well organized this tabur was. They did not know what discipline prevailed among the defenders. They did not know that Zagorowski and Tiskowski had planned every detail of this defense. They did not know they were making the biggest mistake of their lives. The first Tatar detachment moved to attack. 1,000 horsemen charged at the tabur at full gallop. The earth trembled under their hooves. War cries tore the air. This was supposed to break the spirit of the defenders, to make them panic. Silence reigned in the tabur. The soldiers waited. Fingers on triggers, eyes on targets, awaiting the order. Zagorowski raised his hand. Tatars at 150 m, 120, 100. The hand dropped. The order rang out short and clear. Fire. 200 muskets fired simultaneously. The thunder of the volley ripped through the air. White smoke filled the space around the tabur. For a second, nothing was visible. Then the smoke cleared and revealed the result. The first line of the Tatar attack lay on the ground. Horses without riders galloped chaotically. The wounded cried, trying to get up. The dead lay motionless. One volley destroyed the head of the attacking unit, but there were thousands behind them. The second line of Tatars did not even slow down. They jumped over the bodies of their comrades. They continued their advance. 60 m to the tabur, 50. The Polish shooters frantically reloaded their weapons. Powder, bullet, ramming, 30 seconds to reload. They wouldn't make it. But Zagorowski had foreseen this. A second line of defense. Soldiers with loaded weapons stepped forward. Again, the order. Again, the volley. Again, a hail of lead into the Tatar ranks. Dozens more fell. Horses stumbled on the stakes between the wagons. Riders flew over their horses directly onto Polish lances. The Tatars reached the tabur. They tried to jump over the wagons. Some succeeded. They landed inside the defense. This was their last mistake. Polish Pancerni and Hussars were already there. The saber flashed in the sun. The head of a Tatar warrior fell to the ground. Another tried to resist. A Polish lance pierced his chest. He fell without a cry. The wagons withstood the first blow. The chains held the structure. The stakes stopped most of the horses. Those Tatars who dismounted to fight on foot became easy targets. Polish shooters now fired individually, aiming at specific targets. Each shot meant one dead Tatar. The first assault lasted, perhaps, 5 minutes, perhaps 10. Then the Tatar commanders ordered a retreat. Trumpets sounded the signal for withdrawal. The horsemen rode out of range of the Polish muskets. Behind them they left 200, possibly 300 bodies. Blood soaked into the soil of the Ukrainian steppe. In the tabur, Controlled activity reigned. Zagorowski shouted orders. Check losses, reload weapons, replenish ammunition, repair damaged wagons, bring water to the wounded. Every second of respite had to be used. Polish losses were minimal. 3 wounded, no one killed. Tatar arrows hit the wagons, bounced off armor, got stuck in the ground. The cuirasses and hussar armor held. What was a terrible defeat for the Tatars was just a warm-up for the Poles. The Tatar commanders could not believe it. 300 men lost in one attack. The tabur still stood. The Poles were still fighting. The Tatar commanders could not believe it. 300 men lost in one attack. The tabur still stood. The Poles were still fighting. The Tatar commanders could not believe it. 300 men lost in one attack. The tabur still stood. The Poles were still fighting. The second wave of attack was twice as large. 2,000 horsemen moved simultaneously, this time from 3 sides at once. The plan was simple. Scatter the defense, find a weak spot, break through with numerical superiority. Zagorowski and Tyszkowski noticed the maneuver. They ordered a regrouping of forces, reinforcing the attacked sectors. Hussars moved to where the attack would be strongest. Pancerni took defensive positions. Dragoons checked ammunition. The Tatars attacked from 3 sides simultaneously. The earth trembled under the hooves of 6,000 horse legs. The air filled with shouts. This was supposed to be the decisive blow. This was supposed to break Polish resistance. Again, Polish volleys rang out, but now from 3 directions. Smoke, thunder, screams. Tatars fell by the hundreds, but there were so many that the next ones still advanced. They reached the wagons, tried to overturn them, pulled at the chains, chopped at the stakes with axes. In several places, the defensive line looked threatened. The wagons swayed. Tatars poured through them, but hussars were waiting there. Heavy cavalry in full armor with long swords and sabers. These were not ordinary soldiers. This was a war machine. One hussar fought 5 Tatars at once. Tatar sabers slid off Polish armor. A Polish sword cut through a Tatar breastplate as if through butter. Heads flew, arms fell off, blood spurted. This was not a duel. It was a massacre. In the second sector, Tatars broke through the first stake barrier and poured inside. Pancerni warriors counterattacked. 20 horsemen burst from the tabur, descending on the flank of the Tatar onslaught. Polish lances pierced bodies, sabers cut necks. In the chaos, the Tatars retreated. The third sector held without serious incident. Volleys were measured, disciplined. Shooters reloaded, fired, reloaded, fired, mechanically, without haste, without panic. A wall of Tatar corpses rose before them. The second wave of attack lasted longer, 20, maybe 30 minutes. The Tatars fought fiercely. Some penetrated deep into the tabur, but perished there at the hands of Polish infantry. Others tried to set the wagons on fire. Poles extinguished the fires and eliminated the arsonists. Finally, the second wave retreated to the sound of trumpets. Tatar commanders watched in disbelief. Another attack repelled. Hundreds more men lost. Perhaps 600, maybe more. The tabur still stood. The Poles were still fighting. A tense but controlled atmosphere reigned in the tabur. Losses began to rise. 8 wounded, 2 killed, 1 wagon heavily damaged. Ammunition was dwindling, but still enough. Water was rationed. Every sip counted. The soldiers were tired. Reloading a musket required strength. Close combat exhausted even the most resilient. But discipline held. No one thought of surrender. No one spoke of defeat. Everyone knew, either victory or death. There was no third option. Tatar leaders conferred. They had already lost over 1,000 men, perhaps 100. This was more than in many full-scale battles. And they were facing only 400 men in wooden wagons. This was humiliating. This was impossible. This could not continue. The third wave would be the most powerful. 5,000 horsemen, all reserves. An attack from all sides simultaneously. There would be no retreat until victory. Either the tabur would fall, or the Tatar army would retreat. This would be the decisive clash. Polish commanders noticed the preparations. They saw the huge mass of warriors preparing for the assault. Zagorowski looked at Tyszkowski. Tyszkowski nodded. Both understood that this would be the most severe test. If they survived the third wave, perhaps the Tatars would retreat. If not, history would forget the 400 brave soldiers of Hodów. The orders were brief. Every bullet must find its mark. Every blow must kill. There was no room for mistakes, no room for weakness. The third wave approached, and this time the Tatars fought with the desperation of men who could not afford to lose. 5,000 Tatar horsemen simultaneously advanced from the north, south, east, and west. The tabur was surrounded on all sides. This was not just an attack. It was a tsunami of men and horses. The earth trembled as if in an earthquake. Dust rose high into the air. The cries of thousands of throats created a hellish chorus. Zagorowski stood in the center of the tabur, calm, focused. Orders followed one after another. North sector, readiness. South sector, fire on my signal. East, hold position. West, reserve, ready to support. Everyone knew what to do. The first volleys rang out almost simultaneously from all sides. 400 muskets fired at short intervals. The roar was deafening. Smoke created a cloud around the tabur. For a moment, nothing was visible. Only screams could be heard. Screams of the dying, screams of fury. The Tatars crashed against the tabur like a sea wave against a rock. They battered the wagons with all their might. Several chains broke. One wagon overturned. A breach appeared in the defense. 20 Tatars broke through it. Hussars were already there. 6 Pancerni warriors confronted 20 attackers. This was not fair combat. It was a slaughter. A hussar's saber cut through Tatar armor like a knife through butter. A lance pierced 2 men at once. Tatars died in seconds. The breach was filled with bodies. The southern sector fought most fiercely. The greatest force of the Tatar attack was concentrated there. Perhaps 1,000 horsemen advanced on a section defended by 80 Poles. The mathematics were brutal. 20 Tatars per Pole. But the Poles had the advantage of position. They shot from above. The wagons protected them from most arrows. Each volley mowed down dozens of attackers. Tatars tried to get closer. They died on the stakes. They tried to jump over. They died in mid-air, pierced by bullets. They tried to break through by force and over the wagons. They died in hand-to-hand combat. Tiskowski personally commanded the southern sector. He stood on a wagon, visible to all. A Tatar arrow flew an inch from his head. Another hit his breastplate and bounced off. A third stuck into the wood of the wagon next to him. He didn't even flinch. He gave orders in a calm voice. Reload, aim, fire, and again, an hour of fighting, 2 hours. The concept of time blurred. Only one thing mattered: reloading, shooting, destroying the enemy. Polish warriors acted like flawless mechanisms. Hands mechanically repeated the same movements. Powder, bullet, ramrod, aiming, firing, and again, powder, bullet, ramrod, aiming, firing. Ammunition began to run out. Zagorowski ordered to conserve shells. Fire only at targets in the immediate vicinity of the tabur. Wait for the others. Hold out until the Tatars lose their offensive ardor. The eastern flank received a short respite. Tatar attacks weakened there, concentrating on the southern and western directions. The soldiers took advantage of this pause. They drank water, bandaged wounds, and reloaded weapons. Some prayed quickly and quietly. Others simply breathed deeply, regaining their strength. The western flank repelled a fourth local wave of attack. The Tatars showed incredible persistence. They continued to advance, attempting to break through the defense again and again. Each attack was repelled. Each cost them dozens of lives, until a real mountain of corpses rose around the tabur. Horses refused to run through this mess. Riders were forced to spur them on. The critical moment arrived in the third hour of the battle. The Tatars concentrated all their forces on one section in the northwest corner of the tabur. 2,000 warriors simultaneously descended on a section defended by 50 Poles, a superiority of 40. 1. Wagons buckled under this pressure. Chains broke. Stakes were ripped from the ground. Tatars poured in like water through a breach in a dam. 100, 200, 300. It seemed like the end. Zagorowski instantly assessed the threat. He shouted, "Hussar reserve, to the northwest immediately." 30 hussars in full armor, uttering war cries, galloped through their own tabur. It looked like madness, but it worked. The hussars struck the flank of the Tatar advance. A dull thud, a full-blown heavy cavalry charge with lances lowered. The effect was devastating. The first lances pierced 4 Tatars each. They broke, but they had already inflicted damage. The Hussars drew their sabers. A real massacre began. One Hussar fought 10 Tatars. A Tatar saber struck a helmet, bounced off, hit a cuirass, bounced off, struck a shoulder. The vambrace stopped the blow. A Polish saber struck. One, a severed arm, a second strike, a pierced skull, a third strike, a pierced throat. Tatars retreated before one man. Pancerni joined the Hussars. The hand-to-hand combat turned the northwestern sector into a quagmire. Blood up to the ankles. Bodies lay on top of each other. Groans of the wounded mingled with the war cries of the attackers. Smoke, dust, sweat, blood. All this created a fog through which the enemy was barely visible. But Polish discipline held. Each soldier knew his place. Each knew whom to protect. Hussars formed a line. Pancerni covered the flanks. Infantry shot from behind them. The Tatars were more numerous, but the Poles were organized. 10, 15, 20 minutes of hand-to-hand combat. In a medieval battle, this was an eternity. Arms ached from swinging sabers. Shoulders were stiff from the weight of armor. Legs trembled from exertion, but no one fell. No one retreated. The Tatars began to withdraw, first individually, then in groups. Finally, all at once, they ran through the passage they had made themselves. The Poles did not pursue. They had no strength. They breathed heavily, watching the enemy flee. The northwestern section resembled a slaughterhouse. 200 Tatar warriors lay dead inside the tabur, another 300 or 400 outside. Polish losses: 15 killed, 20 wounded. Heavy, but not critical. Zagorowski ordered to repair the breach. Soldiers dragged away bodies, rearranged wagons, restored defensive structures. The work proceeded in silence. Everyone was too tired to talk. Water was distributed, small sips, but for everyone. The wounded were bandaged, the dead laid out in a row. The Tatars retreated. The retreat was not complete but noticeable. They moved out of musket range, lit fires, tended to their wounded. Their losses were enormous. Perhaps 2,000 killed, maybe 2,500. This was more than in most large battles. The Tatar commanders conferred. They saw the tabur. They saw the 400 Poles. They counted their losses. It was simply impossible. How could 400 men kill 2,500 of the best Tatar warriors? How could they continue to defend themselves? How could they still stand? But the numbers didn't lie. For every Pole killed, the Tatars lost 20 to 30 men, maybe more. This was not a battle. It was suicide. But to retreat, to return to the Khan with the news that 400 Poles had routed a 40,000-strong horde. Who would believe it? Who would not laugh at them? They had to try again. They had to break this damned tabur. They had to kill these damned Poles, or they themselves would die of shame. But something changed in the tabur. Zagorowski and Tiskowski looked at the enemy. They saw fatigue. They saw indecision. They saw fear. And they knew it was time. Time to stop defending. Time to attack. Zagorowski and Tiskowski stood in the center of the tabur. They looked at each other. They didn't need to speak. Both saw the same thing. The Tatars were psychologically broken. Their attacks were weakening. Their formation was disorganized. Commanders shouted orders, but the fighters reacted slowly, reluctantly. This was no longer a confident horde, but a frightened mob. The decision was made instantly. Counterattack. Now, while the Tatars were disorganized, while their spirit was broken, one decisive blow could turn the retreat of the Tatar horde into a complete rout. Orders were given quickly. Hussars prepared their horses. Pancerni prepared for the attack. Dragoons covered the tabur, and the infantry remained in defense. Not everyone would go on the offensive. Half would remain to defend the base. The wounded, tired, those without horses, would form the last line of defense. 200 horsemen prepared for the attack, 100 hussars and 100 pancerni. The horses were tired, but still capable of fighting. Soldiers checked their saddles, adjusted their armor, drew their sabers. Some took fresh lances, others checked their pistols. The Tatars saw movement in the tabur. They understood that the Poles were preparing something, but they didn't realize what it was. They thought it was a defensive regrouping. It never occurred to them that 400 men, who had just defended themselves against 40,000, were now preparing to attack. The gates of the tabur opened, but not all of them. Only those on the western side, where the Tatar concentration was lowest. Wagons were moved aside. A wide road was created for the exit, wide enough for a cavalry charge. Zagorowski rode out first. Behind him, hussars in a dense formation, 100 Pancerni horsemen in full armor with lances pointed forward. They looked like a silver wall of death. Hussar wings fluttered somewhere behind, in the wind. The psychological effect was immense. The Tatars looked. They couldn't believe their eyes. The Poles were attacking. After hours of defense, after losing some men, after expending most of their ammunition, they were attacking. This was madness. But this madness was rushing directly at them. The first Tatar line tried to prepare. Archers raised their weapons, fired. Arrows flew at the Polish cavalry. Most bounced off their armor. A few hit horses. Some found gaps in the armor. But the attack did not slow down. The hussars crashed into the Tatar formation with the force of a locomotive. Lances pierced the first rows. One hussar broke through 2 Tatars with 1 lance. The lances broke, but they were already dead. Horses scattered the Tatar horsemen. Tatars fell from their saddles, trampled by Polish horses. Behind the hussars came the Pancerni. They didn't have long lances. They had sabers and fury. 3 hours spent in the tabur. 3 hours of defense. 3 hours of witnessing the death of comrades. All this exploded now. Sabers flashed in the sun. Each blow meant a dead Tatar. The Tatar line broke. It simply ceased to exist. 100 Polish horsemen destroyed 1,000 Tatars in 2 minutes. This was not a battle. It was a demolition. Tatars fled in all directions. Some tried to defend themselves. They died on the spot. Others simply threw down their weapons and ran. Polish commanders saw the panic. Order to pursue. 200 horsemen divided into smaller groups. Each group pursued the fleeing Tatars. This was not an attack. It was a hunt. A group of 30 Pancerni pursued 200 Tatars. Having caught up after a kilometer, the fight lasted 3 minutes. 200 Tatars lay dead. 30 Poles continued their way, seeking new targets. Another group, 20 hussars, stumbled upon a Tatar detachment trying to regroup. 300 warriors formed a line, ready to resist. The hussars attacked without hesitation. 20 lances pierced the first row. Sabers finished the rest. 300 Tatars ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The main mass of the Tatar army was no longer fighting. It was fleeing. Commanders tried to stop their men, formed defensive lines. Some obeyed. Most simply rode east, south, in all directions away from the Polish cavalry. Zagorowski led a group of 50 hussars directly into the center of the Tatar formation, where the Khan's banners stood, where the highest commanders were. This was bold. This was insane. This was genius. The Tatar guard tried to stop the Poles. 200 of the Khan's best warriors stood to fight. This was the elite. These were not ordinary steppe horsemen. These were experienced veterans, but against them stood Polish hussars, the best heavy cavalry of the 15th century. The clash lasted 5 minutes, bloody, brutal, without mercy. The Tatar guard fought bravely, but the hussars were unstoppable. After 5 minutes, the guard ceased to exist. The Khan's banners fell to the ground. The Tatar commanders fled. They saw that the battle was lost. They saw that only 2 options remained, flight or death. They chose life. They galloped east, leaving the army to its fate. The pursuit lasted an hour, maybe 2. Polish horsemen were tired, but driven by adrenaline. Tatars were demoralized, scattered, helpless. They died by the hundreds along the escape routes. Some tried to defend themselves in small groups. They were systematically annihilated. Finally, Zagorowski gave the order to cease pursuit. The horses were exhausted. The men had reached the limit of their capabilities. They had significantly distanced themselves from the tabur and had to return before the Tatars could regroup and launch a counterattack. The return journey led through the battlefield. The steppe was strewn with bodies. Thousands of Tatar warriors lay dead. In the low-lying areas of the terrain, blood collected in puddles. The air was saturated with the smell of death. Crows circled above the field, anticipating a feast. Polish soldiers returned to the tabur in silence. They were too exhausted to cheer with joy, too stunned by what had happened to celebrate victory. They had killed thousands of men, crushed an army 100 times larger, and survived the impossible. The tabur still stood. Dragoons and infantrymen welcomed the returning heroes. There were shouts, embraces, tears of relief, but there was also sadness. 28 comrades would not return. 28 brave soldiers had given their lives in this battle. Zagorowski and Tiskowski conducted an inspection. They counted losses, checked supplies, assessed the condition of the detachment. 28 killed, 42 wounded, over 170 still combat-ready. Ammunition was almost depleted, water was running out, food would last a few days, but the Tatars were already gone. Those who survived had fled. So far they would not return. The battle was won. 400 Poles had defeated 40,000 Tatars. It sounds like a fairy tale, but it's true. The battlefield speaks for itself. Polish soldiers collected trophies. Tatar sabers, bows, arrows, armor, hundreds of horses. Khan's banners, fallen in the mud. These were trophies. These were proof. Counting Tatar losses was a grim task. Bodies everywhere, densely around the tabur. On the escape routes every few tens of meters. The exact number could not be determined. 3,000, 4,000, maybe more. No one knew for sure. One thing was certain. The Crimean Khanate had lost a significant part of its army. Not only men, but also prestige. News of this defeat would spread throughout the region. Tatars, who had terrorized the Commonwealth for decades, were humiliated by a handful of Poles. Night fell on Hodów. Fires burned in the tabur. Soldiers sat around them, talking quietly. Some exhausted slept. Others looked at the fire, reflecting on their experience. 28 comrades were buried on the edge of the tabur. A brief prayer, simple crosses, no time for more. Zagorowski and Tiskowski stood together, looking at the stars. They had won an impossible battle, saved their lives and the lives of their men. They had stopped the Tatar invasion. For this, they would be remembered. But now they thought only of one thing. Tomorrow they had to return home. News of the defeat at Hodów reached Bakhchisarai, the capital of the Crimean Khanate. Within a week, messengers arrived one after another, each with worse news. The first report spoke of an unsuccessful attack on the Polish tabur. The second, of heavy losses. The third, of a complete defeat and flight. Khan Selim Giray could not believe it. He had sent 40,000 warriors to Chapku, experienced commanders, proven units, the best steppe cavalry. Against them stood 400 Poles. The mathematics were simple, victory certain, and half the army returned to him demoralized, without loot, without prisoners. How to explain such a defeat? How to tell the Turkish Sultan that his vassals had been humiliated by a handful of Christians? The losses were unacceptable. From 3,500 to 4,000 warriors killed. This was an entire generation of Tatar military nobility. Sons, brothers, fathers, killed near some forgotten Polish town. The morale of the Tatars plummeted to an unprecedented level. Warriors fleeing from Hodów told stories of invincible Polish knights in shining armor, of a tabur that could not be breached, of muskets that killed at 100 minute, of Polish cavalry that swept like a storm. In the following years, the frequency of Tatar raids on the Commonwealth sharply decreased. Not completely. Tatars still made shafats, but avoided large clashes with regular Polish units. Thus, the memory of Hodów served as a warning. They would never again underestimate Polish forces, regardless of their numbers. In the Commonwealth, news of the victory spread like wildfire. 400 heroes, 40,000 enemies defeated, a ratio of 1 to 100. It sounded like a legend. But it happened here, now, on Polish soil. Zagorowski and Tiskowski were summoned to Warsaw. King Jan II, Sobieski, the victor of Vienna, himself a great commander, received them personally. He listened with disbelief. He asked for details to be repeated, checked the figures. Everything added up. It was not an exaggeration, not a legend, it was reality. The commanders and soldiers were showered with awards and honors. Zagorowski received land holdings, Tiskowski, a title, and gold. Each of the 400 surviving soldiers received a lifelong pension. The wounded were treated at the expense of the royal treasury. The Battle of Hodów entered the Polish military canon. Military academies studied Zagorowski's and Tiskowski's tactics. The tabur, as a field fortification, became a standard element of training. A combination of fire discipline, fortification, and cavalry counterattack. All this stemmed from the lesson of Hodów. International recognition came more slowly. Western Europe was busy with its own wars. The War of the Spanish Succession, conflicts with France, colonial battles. This overshadowed events in the East. But those who heard of Hodów were impressed. Comparisons to Thermopylae were inevitable. 300 Spartans against 1,000 Persians. A legend of antiquity. 400 Poles against 40,000 Tatars. A modern fact. The difference. The Spartans fell to the last man. The Poles won and survived. Military analysis reveals several key factors for victory. First, the brilliant choice of position. The field of Hodów was not chosen by chance. The terrain provided defensive advantages. Second, the construction of the tabur. The wagon train was professionally set up, reinforced with chains and stakes. Third, fire discipline. No wasted ammunition. Each volley on command. Each shot aimed. Fourth, the quality of the soldiers. This was the elite. Hussars and Pancerni were the best trained warriors of the Commonwealth. Each of them was worth 10 ordinary soldiers. Fifth, the command. Zagorowski and Tiskowski cooperated without disagreements. They made decisions quickly and maintained their composure under pressure. But above all, one factor stands out. Courage. 400 men decided to confront a 40,000-strong army. They could have fled. They could have avoided battle. They chose to stand and fight. This decision, this courage, is the true foundation of victory. The Tatars never officially acknowledged the scale of the defeat. In their chronicles, Hodów is mentioned in passing, or not at all. But the numbers don't lie. After 1694, Tatar military activity against the Commonwealth sharply declined. Something broke at Hodów. Not just men, but faith in their own invincibility. For the Commonwealth, Hodów was proof that even in difficult times, even when the main armies were tied up on other fronts, small detachments could achieve great results. It is a lesson about the value of discipline, training, leadership. It is an inspiration for future generations of soldiers. Historians to this day debate whether Hodów was a miracle, brilliant strategy, or simply luck. The truth lies somewhere in between. All these elements converged, but without the courage of 400 men who stood against overwhelming odds, none of these factors would have mattered. The Battle of Hodów is proof that in war, numbers do not always decide, that a small, well-managed, disciplined force can defeat an enemy many times its size, that sometimes 200 Poles with sabers are worth more than 10,000 undisciplined mercenaries. Hodów is a symbol. A symbol that what is possible when people do not surrender to the impossible. 400 soldiers looked at a 40,000-strong army and did not flee. They stood their ground, fought, and won. This is a lesson that transcends time and place. What did they prove that day? That numerical superiority does not guarantee victory, that discipline defeats chaos, that one well-trained soldier can be worth a dozen unmotivated mercenaries, that skilled command can equalize any disparity. Żółkiewski and Chodkiewicz were not brilliantly innovative strategists. They did not invent new tactics. They used what they had. Wagons, muskets, cavalry, in the most effective way. It was flawless execution. Not a revolution. But sometimes flawless execution is all that is needed. The Polish Hussars etched themselves into history as one of the most effective cavalry formations ever to exist. Hodów is the most striking example of their capabilities. Not in open combat, not in a traditional charge, but in a combination of defense and counterattack. It showed that Hussars were not only a fearsome shock force but also a versatile combat unit. History knows other battles with extreme imbalances of power. Thermopylae, 300 Spartans. Rorke's Drift, 150 Britons against 4,000 Zulus. The Alamo, less than 200 Texans. But Hodów stands out in one respect. The Poles not only survived, they crushed the enemy. Why is Hodów less known than Thermopylae? Perhaps because the Poles survived. Tragedy attracts more attention than triumph. The Spartans who died to the last man is an epic story. The Poles who returned home after routing the enemy is simply a job well done. History is sometimes unfair, but for those who know the military history of Eastern Europe, Hodau shines like a beacon. It is a reminder that the Commonwealth for centuries was a shield that stopped invasions from the east. Tatars, Muscovy, Turks, all broke against Polish defenses. Hodau is one of the most striking examples of this role. The lessons of Hodau are relevant even today. In an era of modern warfare dominated by technology, it is easy to forget the fundamentals, but these fundamentals have remained unchanged since the 15th century. Discipline, training, command, courage, these are what still determine the outcome of any confrontation. If Żółkiewski and Chodkiewicz had succumbed to panic, if they had ordered a retreat, if the soldiers had been gripped by fear, all would have died or fled in disgrace. But instead, they maintained their composure, trusted their men, executed their plan, and turned an undeniable defeat into a brilliant victory. Those 400 men at Hodau were not superheroes. They were ordinary soldiers. They had fear, they had doubts, they saw the enemy's superiority. But they also had something more: faith in each other, faith in their commanders, faith that a job well done could overcome any obstacle. This is the true legacy of Hodau. Not numbers, not statistics, not geographical details, but the idea that determination and professionalism can overcome any advantage, that the impossible becomes possible only when you give up. Today, over 300 years later, Hodau remains an inspiration to soldiers who learn that quality surpasses quantity, for leaders who understand that calm leadership in a crisis saves lives, for everyone who faces overwhelming circumstances. 400 Poles against 40,000 Tatars, a ratio of 1:100. The outcome, Polish victory. It seemed incredible, but it happened, and it is the most beautiful lesson of all. Sometimes the impossible is just what has not yet been achieved. The 11th of June, 1694. A date that every military history enthusiast should know. The day when 400 Polish soldiers etched themselves into the annals as authors of one of the most incredible victories in history. Mathematics spoke clearly. 1:100. Logic dictated flight. Common sense commanded avoidance of conflict. But Żółkiewski, Chodkiewicz, and their 400 men chose a different path. They stood, fought, and won. The Tatar horde, numbering from 25,000 to 40,000 warriors, was routed with 3,000 to 4,000 killed. The rest fled in panic. The prestige of the Crimean Khanate was destroyed. Polish losses: 28 killed, 42 wounded. A disproportion that still amazes the imagination. This was no ordinary defense. It was a methodical, brutal, perfectly executed plan to annihilate the enemy. The tabur as a fortress, fire discipline as a weapon, counterattack as a coup de grace, the final blow. Every element was honed, every movement thought out. Did you know about the Battle of Hodów before this material? If not, now you do. If yes, then hopefully you have learned new details, new perspectives. This is a story that deserves to be told. Leave comments. What impressed you the most? The genius of the commanders, the courage of the soldiers, the effectiveness of the counterattack, or perhaps the very fact that 400 men routed 40,000? If you believe such stories should be more widely known, subscribe. There are so many forgotten battles, so many unknown heroes, so many incredible victories waiting to be discovered. Share this material with friends interested in military history. Hodów is a story that shows that sometimes truth is more incredible than fiction, that sometimes David truly defeats Goliath, that sometimes the impossible becomes possible. In the next material, we will examine other forgotten battles of Polish military history, battles that changed the course of history but were forgotten by textbooks, stories that deserve to see the light. Hodów taught us one thing: never underestimate the enemy, regardless of how small they are. Never assume victory just because you have numerical superiority. And never, ever give up as long as the fight is on. The 400 Polish warriors at Hodów could have fled, could have surrendered, could have died anonymously. Instead, they chose to fight and won an impossible battle. This is true bravery. This is true victory. Thank you for watching. See you in the next episode. And for now, remember Hodów. Remember the 400. Remember that sometimes numbers mean nothing. Courage does.